So thank you everyone for joining. I hope you're expecting to see the webinar as indicated on the screen there. So from vulnerable to resilience, it's a session specifically to look at how organisations, principally in the public sector, but you know, the same applies to any organisation with Active Directory, how they can move their Active Directory environment as a critical component of IAM security generally, from what is quite frequently a fairly vulnerable state to one that is improved resilience and then potentially transformed. So we'll start with a bit of housekeeping. So we will have a Q&A or chat option. So if you've got any questions as we run through, excuse me, either put the question in the chat or the Q&A. It doesn't really matter which one. We will try to respond to all of those at the end of the session, so from about 45 minutes onwards. If you've got time to stay on past quarter two, then that's fine. We the team that you see on the screen there, Harry, myself and Dominic, will be staying on for about another 15 minutes to answer any questions. If we don't get any or there's so many that we can't answer, we'll respond back and just send a note out to all of the attendees with all of the questions on, just highlighting what our responses are to each in turn. Somebody will reach out anyway with the offer of a free AD security assessment that is kindly being provided by Quest and will be supported by MTI consultants as well. And also we've got a consultancy piece that we're offering as a free consultancy by way of a draw that we'll do, that we random. We'll reach out to the winner of that. If you're not interested in that, when we've reached out, we'll just hit the next one. I know some people aren't able to avail themselves of that, but that'll be a piece of more in-depth consultancy. So the team on the call then, so I'm joined by Dominic Bland, who's Technical Director from First Response. First Response and MTI have worked together for a long time, over 10 years certainly, and in the last 5 years particularly have been really heavily engaged in a number of fairly wide-scale Active Directory discovery and review exercises, as well as a lot of remediation support in the public sector. Any NHS organisations on might know that service that's offered from technical remediation within NHS England. So we've done a lot of work, Dominic and I, over the last few years on understanding the common problems in AD security. We are talking about on-prem AD security. There is certainly a move towards Entra and hybrid state, but certainly in lots of environments in the public sector, Active Directory on-prem is still the prevalent and the dominant authentication mechanism for all services. And then Harry Sweetman's joining us from Quest. Harry's a CISP and has got some really great experience and an understanding of management of AD and monitoring of Active Directory. And also, really critically, the final piece in the puzzle, if all your defences do somehow go awry, then recovery of Active Directory we'll touch on as well at the end, which is absolutely a critical component of recovering systems in the event of particularly ransomware attacks. So the agenda we'll run through. I'll quickly touch on the rising threat landscape, what we know from all those reports, what we think is going to happen in the next 5 years, particularly, essentially to nest AD within its wider context of identity and access management security, and actually digital transformation more generally. Dominic will then pick up on Active Directory risks specifically, and how to and what to do to configure your environment to try and protect against the most common risks. And then Harry will pick up on the piece around monitoring and management and recovery of Active Directory. We'll finish off at the end very quickly with the Q&A and highlight slide of what to do as next steps if you're interested in any of the those reviews that we talked about. So the nesting of Active Directory into a bit of context. So Active Directory is now 25 years old, so it's a happy birthday to Active Directory. Year 2000 was when the first directories went in. So it's been it's been effectively the most commonly used authentication and authorization really point within Windows infrastructure for the last 25 years. It has obviously been developed at a time where particularly human operated ransomware was far less prevalent and far less sophisticated than it is today. So we wanted to sort of touch on what the world was like a little bit in the year 2000, and a little bit about where we are today, the 2025 number, and a little look forward to 2030. Principally because most of you are public sector entities and organisations, and the government cybersecurity strategy sets out a really very clear vision for 2030, by which time it wants all of public service providers to be resilient to known vulnerability. And if you are going to pick a known vulnerability, then the one that you would, and attackers do, pick most frequently is those around Active Directory, because it's such a great way to get access to everything in your environment. It wasn't designed to be a security tool. I think Dominic will touch more closely on that. So yeah, I mean, there's obviously been a huge proliferation in data, in IoT devices, in a number of people in the world, actually, since 2020. And critically, the amount of coverage and the quality of coverage that people have to be able to access workloads on devices wherever they are really on the globe. And by 2030, that's predicted to double the amount of data in the world to 300 zettabytes by 2030. The number of IoT devices, again, predicted to double from what it is today. It's less than 200 million in the year 2000, and we're looking at nearly 30 billion by the end of this decade. People not necessarily growing at such an exponential rate, thank goodness, but certainly their ability to access services on digital devices is absolutely going through the roof. So all of that will mean there is far greater access to devices and services from outside the traditional security perimeter between now and 2030. That's only going to get worse. So the critical things that we've seen on environments in the last few years of work are that there's been 25 years really of configuration drift in Active Directory. Far too many tier 0 assets are out there. So by that I mean enterprise admins or domain admins, and that there are a lot of access controls that people don't really understand what they are, or should they be there. They're not documented particularly well, and there isn't really any tiering in Active Directory. So it's not done to a degree where it's effective. So there's no separation of tier 0, tier 1, tier 2 accounts. So if you add those problems, effectively they're problems of technical or digital debt, to the current geopolitical landscape that we're seeing in the world, to the thing that's really driving that proliferation in assets and data, which is going to be AI and developments in technology, to the ability of attackers to then really leverage those developments in technology to get inside networks and move in an automated way across networks, then hopefully the picture that we're building here is one that points towards the really critical importance of getting Active Directory security as hardened as possible, as quickly as possible, because in the next 5 years it's going to be very easy for attackers using whatever which of those methods on the screen there to really utilize that active AI to get into networks and compromise networks extremely easily. So the way that we see that happening, we MTI and indeed Quest and lots of people in the industry, is the move towards zero trust is absolutely critical, which can be a bit daunting, can be a bit complex. That slide is meant to be a bit of a complex, unstraight journey towards an end goal, the end goal being zero trust. It's not a simple journey. There are lots of different components to it. Certainly you're not going to get there by just buying a product. But you can start really quite well and effectively by picking off targeted elements of a zero trust adoption roadmap. And one of the most critical ones that you need to do is to get to a stable state within IAM security generally. So you'd include MFA in this, but absolutely critically, you would need to include a really good and robust set of hardening activities around Active Directory. So I'll hand over to Dominic to pick up on the detail from there.
Thanks, Jim. Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for your time. My name's Dominic. I'm a principal consultant and director at First Response. I've been dealing with Active Directory since 1998, curiously, just before it came out. And I've spent a long time doing cyber forensics and digital security in various different forms. The last few years, I've been working mostly with Jim and his team, doing audits and assessments across Active Directories. And we developed a very specific audit that we've used in essentially more than 250 different organizations, many of them NHS trusts, that allowed us to see the patterns of behavior across all of these different, quite disparate implementations, and understand the patterns within there, the things that people were getting right and very much the things that people were getting wrong. So the patterns that we discovered while we were looking through all of this data allowed us to classify the issues that we were finding into what we call point fixes and structural changes. Point fixes tend to be the smaller things where you can generally flick a switch to fix a problem. Something like turn off old NTLM protocols, disable old server message block protocols. A lot of it is focused around that area. Reset Kerberos baseline passwords so that they can't be used for persistence by an attacker. So these are the point fixes, small things. Sometimes they require a small project to to check the environment and make sure that flicking the switch isn't going to blow anything up. But generally, they're small, independent issues. But there were a lot of issues that we came across, issues around the separation of user and admin authority, having too many higher authority identities within the system, the littering of higher identity accounts all over the place. And all of these together, we were able to group together as a structural flaw, a structural change. So a structural change is required to fix these things, because to fix them, you need to fix a whole bunch of things simultaneously. And only when you fix enough of those things together do you actually get a security improvement. And each step along the way does give you these little marginal security improvements, but it's only when you get to a certain level, a certain structural stability, that you've actually got a really powerful change in the system, and a change that will last and is maintainable. A lot of this is based around the simple idea that there is a flaw at the heart of the Windows system. And this flaw is to do with caching. Every time an account logs onto anything within the system, that account is cached on either the workstation or the server or the domain controller, because generally we split the network into workstations. You can see the bottom left of the diagram, servers in the middle on the right, and domain controllers as the controller systems above them. But whenever an account it logs on, a cache of that account credential is left behind. You've all come across the pass the hash attack, or at least heard of it. This is the ability of an attacker to lift credentials and then use those credentials. The problem we have here is that credentials of all sorts, client level credentials, server level credentials, and domain credentials, are littered across all of the machines in a Windows infrastructure. It's always been this way. It's always been exploited by attackers, but it's quite hard to deal with for a number of reasons. So it's very rarely dealt with. So the keys existing, as I said, in different levels. There are client keys, which would allow an attacker to access user information, the area of shared data that they have access to, and and various other low-grade functions of the system. If an attacker can get hold of server keys, they then have access to the SQL databases, the full file shares, not just the little pieces of file shares that the users can see, and making exfiltration of data very, very much easier. They also gain access to the support systems for the network, things like DHCP and in some cases DNS, which allow them to create persistence within the network, to connect and manipulate the way the network functions. If an attacker can get hold of the domain keys, they basically have full control of the entire infrastructure, not just the Windows infrastructure, the whole of the infrastructure, because all of your underlying infrastructure components, things like your VPNs, your switches, your routers, your proxy filters that control network access and all those other devices invariably connect into the Active Directory for their management identities and to determine user access. So getting hold of the domain level identities in Active Directory actually gives an attacker pretty much the entire infrastructure. Sadly, getting into a system and escalating through a system are actually depressingly easy. Getting into a system is, and as Jim was talking about, is getting easier and easier, partly because of the advent of IA, but also because attackers are just getting more experienced. Their code is better, their processes are better, and they become much more professional about it. So you get into a workstation by one of various mechanisms, phishing, more commonly spear phishing, targeted phishing, less commonly direct intrusion, but it still happens. Multi-factor authentication can help, but it's not perfect. Once you get into a workstation, you'll see that a client admin account can be lifted. There's always a client admin account on every workstation. And once that's been lifted, an attacker can then move to all the other workstations in your environment, and they will do this in code automatically, very, very fast. They'll zoom around the client base, and finally they'll find a server, they'll find a client that a server admin has logged onto. They pick up those credentials. Now the attacker is a server admin. They go straight to the servers and they move around the servers until they find a server that a domain admin has logged onto. Now the attacker is a domain admin and they own your entire infrastructure. Like I said, depressingly easy, both get in and even easier to escalate, because the credentials that the attacker needs are just sitting there lying around the system, waiting to be picked up. There is a defense against this, and it's a damn good one, which is zoning. So the idea of zoning is that if the credentials, the server and domain admin credentials, are simply not there, they can't be lifted and used by an attacker. They can't be stolen by an attacker when an attacker breaks into a workstation. Why doesn't everyone do zoning? It's difficult. It's difficult to organize. The structures required for it are not as difficult as you'd imagine, but the transition to it is quite difficult. And to do it at very low risk, to do it fast enough to be effective, and then to enforce it, it's actually quite a terrifying piece of work for internal administrators. It's a rather specialized piece of work. But the need for it, and so you can see when the work is complete, you create a situation where you have administration accounts or accounts with administrative power bandied into specific zones. There will be no domain admin or server admin accounts in the client base, anywhere on the client base, so the attacker can't pick them up. If an attacker by some fluke managed to get a server credential and get themselves into the server layer, there will be no domain admin credentials in the server layer for them to pick up. Very simple concept, and very, very powerful once correctly implemented. And the need for this zoning is actually supported by multiple agencies around the world. This is an extract from a recent document, which was a collaboration between all of the agencies that you can see on the screen there. And the first page of this document, the big grey paragraph on the first page of the document, is the best way to protect Active Directory is to protect the keys, and do that by zoning. And it talks there about zone 1, but it also mentions it talks about zone 0 as the primary zone. That's the domain zone, but it also talks about tiers 1 and 2, which is the server and client zones. Just a little aside from that, because the document talks about MFA and PAM, and we're all very aware of those technologies. It's worth noting that MFAs and PAMs, privileged access managers, are more front-end devices. They deal with managing the authorization of accounts. Certainly that's what MFA is about, hardening the authentication. And PAMs may have some authorization capabilities, but again, their strong point is focusing the login, session recording, centralizing audits, giving you bits and pieces of validation, but role-based authority with administrative zoning actually bakes that validation into the Active Directory itself. So even someone who can evade a PAM or evade MFA will still have an account that is zoned by the Active Directory in the Windows infrastructure natively. It's a very powerful layer of defense. So back on track. How do you get to administrative zoning? Administrative zoning requires a number of steps, and each step has its own benefit, its own security enhancement. But as I said to you before, you have to get a certain way along this path before suddenly all of these things that you've done click into place and start to form a really, really powerful defense. So the first step is to separate admin accounts from user accounts. So that your administrators are not opening emails and browsing the web using an admin account. It's a very obvious separation. We've been used to that for years now. The advice has been there for donkey's years now, and most people do it. The second step is to implement role-based authority. Again, these concepts for role-based authority have been around for ages, and many people have role-based authority designed into their systems. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. But the advantage of role-based authority is that you can now scope your admin accounts, and it creates the possibility that you can limit your higher authority memberships, those domain admin accounts that are so powerful and so dangerous to have floating around the system. Once you have enough role-based authority in place and it's working properly, you can actually empty your domain admin accounts of all, not only the admin accounts that are in it, but the service accounts that are in it as well. And that's a bit that people stick on very badly. The people's willingness to change the powers associated with service accounts is very low because it's a very frightening thing. Changing those powers may change the way the service reacts, may cause a service outage. So it's something people are very loath to do, but it's profoundly important. When you get to this point, you should be able to minimize your total number of domain admins down to a maximum of 5 actual people, 5 administrators, and maybe a couple of services that really do things with the Active Directory, but don't really need, but need specific powers. Most other services just need the odd power here or there, or the ability to manipulate a server that they're running on. Once you've minimized the higher authorities, you've taken a huge step towards strengthening the system, and that minimizing the higher authorities allows you to put a domain boundary in. It's what allows you to collect all of the strength of these 3 components together and make them really powerful. The next step on from that is to separate these authorizations and authorities onto different accounts. So you have anyone who's going to do domain admin work has a domain admin account, but they also have a server admin account. And 90% of the time they do their admin work with their server admin account, and they only ever use their domain admin account to log on to domain controllers. Similarly, you want to separate server admin from client admin onto different actual logins, so that anyone who wants to do client admin work actually logs on with a client admin account. And finally, once you've separated client admin accounts from server admin accounts from domain admin accounts, you put boundaries in the middle of them, technical blocks that actually prevent those accounts from logging on to zones that they're not supposed to log into. And that's when you get right up into the high end of this security, and the system becomes able to protect itself very, very strongly. The Active Directory can do all of this stuff natively. The technology for this is in the Active Directory. There's no software required. It's just a reconfiguration, a layer of security that you need to put right at the top of your Active Directory architecture, which then flows down onto everything in there. This point, around about 6, where we've separated out the domain admins and we can put in a domain boundary, the higher boundary, that's the minimum place that any organization really needs to get to. But even then, you get so much stronger if you take it the full distance. Most organizations think they are about here. They think they've minimized the higher authority membership. But generally speaking, when we go and actually do the audit, when we say how many domain admins have you got, and they say, oh, we've got 5, what they mean is the people, not the actual accounts that have domain admin power. So generally what we're seeing is 30, 40, 50. We've had 250 as well that we came across early in our run of audits. So most organizations think they're about there, but actually most organizations are about here. They have some role-based authority in place. They've done some removal of separation of administrators from domain admins and higher authorities, but it's incomplete. They still have far too many domain admins, and it's not normalized. It's not a normalized working pattern to have everyone with a role-based authority separate from domain admins. Tragically, 2 of the audits we did, the first 200 audits that we did, were at this level. They hadn't actually separated admin and user capabilities at all. So even though that's been a marked step for a long time, it's still in place out there. So how do we do this natively? The first thing you recognise is that these changes, this implementation of role-based authority and zoning is a fundamental requirement for the Active Directory. It's so fundamental, in fact, that exactly the same architecture to present these capabilities can be used in every Active Directory that exists. And I say that quite confidently because I've been doing this for 25 years and I've used iterations of this technique in the whole of that time. More recently, we've just done a more focused, streamlined version of this and have implemented in 10 organizations in the last year, and it's working beautifully in all of them. So any organization can benefit from this, unified, standardized, high-level structure. But you build it using the directory's own components, organization units, groups, GPOs, group policy preferences, and a set of access control for delineating role-based authority. It's standard Active Directory technology, but you just forge it correctly. You format and configure it correctly to produce this amazingly strong result. But all organizations are not the same, and every organization needs to be, when you put this in, every organization needs to be cleaned up. And there are always things that are specific to individual organizations, specific security controls that you have to modify and present in a slightly different way, because you've all seen different Active Directories. They can be wildly different in their presentation, and the application sets and service sets that organizations use are also wildly different. In this particular example, this was a trust with 20,000 users and 700 servers. There were 247 domain admins when we started. There were 5 admins and 4 services when we finished putting in the domain boundary, the higher of those 2 boundaries. When we surveyed the server base, there were 385,000 connection points between users and server administration. So there were 385 potential server logins that we had to assess, handle, make sure they work. And we have to, when you do this work, you have to pick out what is necessary, what is functional, what is dangerous, and what is just legacy. And you get rid of the legacy, mitigate the dangerous, and maintain the necessary. Because if you go through this process and you don't maintain the necessary functions correctly, that's when you start to cause user issues. And we can do this very, very precisely. We've developed analytics over the course of the last year to do this. So we know that this can be done, if it's done correctly, in a 3 to 4 month timescale, depending on kind of involvement and buy-in from the trust. And with very little of the impact on either the administrator and certainly not on the users within the environment. So as we've been doing these projects over the last year and a half, we've discovered that we're able to do this with very, very low risk, as long as you understand what data to pull out and how to manage and manipulate that data. And as I said, there's a cleanup required as well. In that same place, we analysed 40,000 access controls and cleaned out 15,000 of them that were rogue, legacies, dangerous because they presented privilege elevations and so on. So there's this very distinct pattern to the work, to building one of these structures, a core structure that presents these role-based authority functions, and that needs to be tailored a little to the specific environment. So here we end up. If you put role-based authority and administrative zoning in place, you end up with an infrastructure that is massively harder for an attacker to move through. So hard, in fact, that the chances are most attackers will just give up unless they really want the prize in your environment. But you're also making it so much harder for them to move through the environment, having taken away the standard pivoting capability, that they then have to prod things in the environment. They have to do much more work, a lot of it manual, because there are less automations for the other techniques. And this slowing them down, making them do more, making them behave more weirdly, that's the kind of thing that monitoring processes will spot. So the monitoring processes that Harry is going to talk to you about in just a moment will have their functionality increased and enhanced by a good foundation, because a good foundation will force attackers to behave more strangely, giving the monitoring capability more chance to see it. For the strong foundation, the directory a very much stronger resistance to attack as a result, but it also gives it resistance to uncontrolled change and administrative accident. All this higher work that we do, the higher authority boundaries that we put in place, mean that only a very limited number of people can substantively affect the overall security of the system. But like everything else in the technology universe, this foundation is built on a set of rules, and rules that can be broken, rules that may change over time depending on installations and upgrades or an attacker. So it's very, very important that the various attributes and configurations that form this foundation are monitored correctly to keep them safe, to keep them sound. So to talk to you a little bit more about that, I'll hand over to Harry.
Thank you very much, Dom. I'm just jump to the next slide here. And yeah, so hi everyone, my name is Harry Sweetman. I'm the Public Sector Solutions Lead at Quest. I'm also one of our internal cyber resiliency SMEs and a CISSP. And Quest work very closely with MTI to help deliver some solutions to a lot of the conversations that we're having about today. I want to talk a bit about building resilience into your AD security, and now that we know what good looks like. So we just need to sort of approach security as something that's not static, right? It evolves, and we need to ensure that our best practices don't drift outside of the good state. And defense in depth can help with this. I'm sure a lot of you have heard the term defense in depth, and we're going to kind of dive into that a little bit more. But I want you to sort of think about, as I go through these next slide, the idea of fix once, fail later. So before we dive into how we approach AD security, we need to understand some of the challenges that we face with AD in day-to-day. So the first one being that Active Directory attack surface is constantly growing, right? Especially with most of us now being on a hybrid infrastructure with Entra ID, the sheer number of identities that can be leveraged for an attack and the permissions that intertwine those identities, they can be very difficult to keep on top of. We know that 80% of breaches now involve compromised identities, and as Dom mentioned in his previous slides, this is how attackers are getting in. 79% of executives are stating that assessing the exposures within AD is a top security struggle. So when you think about how we simplify this, the second challenge is AD configuration drift. Now, attackers love misconfigurations. So how do we stop our AD from drifting outside of that good state that Dom has just presented us with? This is a top 3 AD security risk, according to Microsoft at the moment. The third challenge is then alert fatigue. We get alerts from so many different sources now. Natively, the logs that get spat out are fairly messy, and in an active attack scenario, we've got little time and capability to be able to sort through that noise. So how do we make sure that the data works for us and not against us? And finally, neglected on premises. We all know, and we've all worked with the brand new shiny identity infrastructure like Entra ID and new emerging technologies like AI. AD often gets left alone and forgotten. Most young people in the industry are no longer being trained on Active Directory, and why would they? It's a 25-year-old organic mess. This is a prime target for an attacker that's looking for a weak spot. We have a growing skills gap for AD and a neglect problem, but the issue is AD is not going away anytime soon. So again, how do we simplify to keeping it in a good state? So Quest's view on cyber resilience in AD is that organizations really should always assume breach. Even the best perimeter defenses nowadays can do nothing to stop the bad guys from eventually breaking through. That's why we need to implement strong internal security and governance. Now, this is where we use the defense in depth approach for our AD security. So we can break this down into different layers. The first layer is remediation and mitigation. So this is spending time to remediate and mitigate vulnerabilities using security governance and administration. Dom covers this with getting your environment into that best practice state. And if possible, the ability to automate this moving forward removes the drift through human error. We can ensure that best practice architecture such as administrative zoning doesn't break through day-to-day changes. The second layer is the ability to continually assess. So this is assessing your permissions, identifying vulnerabilities, and proactively hunting for those misconfigurations and ways through your best practice architecture. The idea here is to essentially be the hacker. There's tooling out there to help us do this automatically. And again, this reinforces that day-to-day changes don't break the hard work that you've put into getting into that good state. And any gaps or permission bloat can be rectified proactively instead of reactively. The third layer that we talk about is the ability to detect an alert. So we can detect an alert on suspicious activity with real-time auditing and alerting. The idea with kind of always assuming breach is that attackers will find a way through. So we need to assume here that an attacker can bypass best practice infrastructure, and this is quite easily achieved by something such as a spear phishing attack on a high-value credential, such as a domain administrator, or perhaps an internal threat even, such as a disgruntled employee that already has the access they need to the environment. If we monitor in real time for suspicious activity and key events that drift outside of the baseline, then we can indicate an ongoing attack and respond to that quicker. And then the fourth and final layer here is the ability to actually investigate and recover from the disaster. So this is what we like to refer to as your insurance policy. Again, if we're always assuming that an attacker will get through, we're always assuming breach. We need to think about how we minimize the impact of that inevitable scenario, how we recover critical services as quickly and effectively as possible. And this comes along with good DR planning and something like a comprehensive AD specific backup solution, because as I'll talk about very shortly, AD is critical to your environment. So first of all, starting with monitoring and why monitoring is important. Every AD evolves over time. Shifting business needs can have a major impact on that and the current state of Active Directory. An example such as mergers and acquisitions can bring huge influxes of change to an environment in a short space of time. And every change with an Active Directory adds a risk that the environment drifts outside of that good state that Dom was previously talking about. Now, configuration drift is unfortunately inevitable. Time is our enemy. Even the securest of environments, if they're left alone over time, will weaken. And attackers love complacency. An untouched, unmonitored environment is a field day for an attacker. Outdated permissions, misconfigurations, and blind spots, they're often low-hanging fruit that don't attract much attention when compared with other attacks such as brute forcing. Now, security is constantly evolving. It's great to get your environment into a best practice state, but you need to maintain it using best practice monitoring and assessment to keep in line with environmental and industry changes. Attackers are always developing and discovering new ways to leverage weak spots, and so a good configuration left alone very quickly becomes a weak one. So this is where we talk about the tripwire layer. This is some of the key points that I wanted to raise with you about monitoring and auditing Active Directory that I think are paramount to ensuring resiliency. So we need to start treating Active Directory as a tier 0 asset that it is. I'm sure most of you will be aware that there are numerous critical services within your organizations that rely on Active Directory being up, and rely on the security of that relies on the ability to essentially secure that identity and access. Any compromise across Active Directory can result in a ripple across the entire environment. We then need to understand that all changes are risk. Any unauthorized accidental configuration changes can open the door to priv-esque, lateral movement, or persistence-based attacks. And once we understand that, we know we can establish known good states for Active Directory policies, objects, and permissions, and we can use those known good states as a baseline for our security across our infrastructure, and we can continuously validate those against that to detect anomalies or drift. Finally, once we've got that baseline, we can then use the ability of that baseline to catch early and contain fast. So again, we perform that real-time detection of suspicious changes on things such as group memberships, GPOs, and trusts, the things that we deem as tier 0, so we can help contain threats as and when they appear before they spread. And then finally, the ability to audit everything but normalize the noise. So collecting audit logs is all well and good, but obviously they're going to be very messy, so we need to normalize that data to make it work for us. And we like to split it into the 5 W's. So who made the change, what changed, where in the environment, when did it happen, and which system was used. So we've put monitoring in place and we understand the importance of monitoring, but what happens if Active Directory is compromised? Well, obviously we've got the technical impact of Active Directory going down, about people not being able to gain access to services, critical things, maybe critical services have gone offline. The example that I like to use is, particularly in NHS, A&E departments, if people can't log into the computers, you're reduced to paper capability. But it's not just that, there's organizational impact as well. Loss of AD can translate to negative media coverage, IP theft, which could break numerous compliance laws, loss of public trust, and then finally, obviously, financial losses themselves. So we recommend maybe performing an AD security risk assessment to gain insight into the security of your AD environment so that you can actually build a picture on what the loss of Active Directory might mean to you. So why is AD disaster recovery critical? Well, again, if we're treating AD as tier 0, we're treating it as the business, right? Without that, operations can grind to a halt. So your recovery strategy needs to treat Active Directory as a first-class priority. We know that AD is often the first target in attack. Ransomware and advanced threat actors, they'll commonly disable or corrupt Active Directory to paralyze response efforts, but also they're using Active Directory to leverage permissions to get to where they need to go. Credential theft can break recovery without isolation. So if attackers get domain admin access, they can destroy backups, tamper with recovery paths, or even embed persistence in your backups themselves. Failing to restore critical services can quickly violate SLAs, GDPR, HIPAA, or industry-specific uptime requirements. And finally, modern attacks destroy trust, not availability. So it's not just enough anymore to just bring AD back online. You need to be sure that you're bringing it back clean and uncompromised, or you risk reintroducing malware. Attackers are smarter nowadays. They know you're taking backups. They're going after the backups as well. So just a few essential actions for disaster recovery planning to help you. The first step is to inventory and assessment. Know your tier 0 assets. As Dom mentioned before, administrative zoning can help with this. Map dependencies and identify what's critical to you to restore first. From here, you can help to set clear recovery objectives. So setting an RTO, an RPO, and MTD, which is recovery time objective. So that's how fast you must recover. Recovery point objective, which is how much data loss is tolerable for the organization. And the maximum tolerable downtime, which is what's the longest your organization can operate without AD before it becoming a disaster scenario. Then we need to prioritize risks and vulnerabilities within AD. So we need to run specific assessments to find the gaps before the attackers do. This will help you build a more resilient environment altogether before even needing to go through DR planning. Now, one of the other ones is to mention that backup doesn't always equal recovery. You need to ensure that your backups are immutable and isolated from primary systems. And you need to make sure you're preparing for scorched earth attacks where nothing is safe. Attackers are smart. They know you're taking backups. They will go for those backups prior to firing off malware. And finally, test it like you mean it. So DR plans aren't really real until they're tested. Something will always go wrong. Something won't be planned. So use teams unfamiliar with that plan to simulate real world pressure, because I can guarantee you when you need to use that plan in real life, the guy that wrote it is going to be on holiday. So make sure that other teams are familiar with it and can use it and understand it, and that will implement resiliency into your DR planning. And finally, before I pass back to Jim here, I just wanted to make a final note on that resiliency is a journey, right? All of these changes are not going to happen overnight. They're going to take time. There's various frameworks available out there to help you with this, one of which is Cyber Assessment Framework. But I'm going to pass back to Jim now to talk a little bit more on that.
Okay, thanks, Harry. Thanks, Dominic. Hope you can all hear me okay. So, I mean, just to close quite quickly, we've got a couple of minutes left of the main event, and then we will there's been a couple of questions asked, so we'll stay on for a bit to answer those. So I guess this last slide is just to reiterate that AD security is, it's an absolutely critical component of cyber resilience. Organizations have to start putting focused effort into getting AD security back into a better, more hardened state. But it's part of a much wider thing, and you can't just focus in on the technical controls in isolation. So, compliance is always going to be important. Harry referenced the CAF there, that's now pretty much ubiquitous across UK government. The CAF will take you down a road towards certainly IAM and privileged access security. Those two specific things are called out, and there are indicators of good practice for both. But it won't specifically get down to a level of detail below that, where you're into really what are the specific standards and almost KPIs that you need to set around Active Directory, number of domain admins. There are several others. So compliance will only really get you so far. So you have to absolutely take a more balanced approach between compliance and risk. You shouldn't just be trying to look to comply with frameworks or mandates. You should take a risk-based approach, and there is nothing more risky than having a very vulnerable Active Directory. And then the approach that you're taking needs to be strategic. So IAM should be seen as a really critical component of your cyber strategy, which should be enabling your digital and your business strategy. So it's crucial to get, if you're a security leader, or if you're working in the digital team, you've got to get the leadership teams of your organizations to really grasp the importance of identity, particularly as an enabler to their wider business programs. And you need a plan. Those full zero trust plans can go on and can get complex, but you have to start somewhere. And there is no more critical component. If you've got an Active Directory still on premise, then making sure that that is in a good and well configured state, and then getting to that as sort of your stabilization phase of that plan before you get into transformation. So really, you've got to focus in on compliance. Yes, you need policy, you need process, you need procedures. You've got to finish in on architecture. You need to bake good architecture into your forward-thinking change program. So secure by design architecture, particularly around the principle of least privilege, needs to be baked into the organization. And then you need to pick up those projects that are formative stabilization projects before you get into the transformation piece, which is fully automating joiners, movers and levers, integrating that with AD and perhaps PAM tools, moving out of on-premise Active Directory, particularly in the client layer, if you can do it, move everything out into cloud managed native, into Intune. That will bring huge security enhancements and enable a lot more security benefits as well. So I think that's about it from us and the team. We do have a few questions, so I'll pause there for a second. If there are any final questions from anyone that has to leave now, then by all means start to put them in the chat. Otherwise, if you don't mind, I'll walk through that. Since Dominic, you've been busy answering a couple. So yeah, one from Sean that's, I think, been recognised by a couple of different people. Hello, Sean. Hello, Dan Batoa. Yeah, so one around NTLM. Dominic, do you want to pick up on that question and reiterate the difficulty, I suppose, of removing NTLM?
Yes, it's a slightly painful process, but it's mostly legacy applications that rely on NTLM being available to them. The process for removing it is quite clear and quite well understood. But the basic process is you monitor the use of the NTLM protocols, because systems that aren't using it just don't fire off the packets across the network. So you can see which servers and clients and applications are actually using the protocol. So your first point is discovery, find out what's using it, put them in a bubble and let them carry on using it, because you can do that with the policies, and then everything else is blocked from using it. And then for each of those systems and applications, you essentially have to go through one at a time. Maybe you'll be able to change that application's validation mechanism. You might be able to make it a SAML service instead of using local NTLM. A lot of services have jumped kind of from old protocol to very new protocol, missing the protocols in the middle. Or you might have to consider replacing services over time with ones that have more modern versions of authentication. So that's the baseline process. It does take time.
Thank you for that, Dominic. So no easy answers with NTLM. So what about the access rights to key identities, domain, server, etc., to other services and functions outside AD? I think.
Okay. So
from it. Go on then, Dominic.
Yeah, so I interpret that question to mean, what about systems that are connected via other non-Windows protocols? So things like LDAP or SAML, maybe going through Azure Online. The main protocol that is used to connect non-Windows systems into the Windows architecture is LDAP. It's a very old protocol. You can wrap some security around it, but at its most basic level, it's clear text username and passwords that you can wrap in a security pipeline. And almost all third-party services, third-party devices use LDAP to connect into the Active Directory. As long as you're securing the pipe between those devices and the Active Directory, so you've got your Active Directory set to only allow secure LDAP calls, it's a strong enough solution. It's very difficult to attack those devices in the normal way. The pivoting that we just talked about doesn't really work outside the Windows infrastructure. So you use it within the Windows infrastructure to get higher credentials, which you can then use to get down into the network kit. So yeah, does that answer your question, Iman?
I think we've disabled the ability for a verbal response there. So if that doesn't answer your question, pop it in the chat. We'll reach out again after this session anyway, Iman. So by all means, reach out and we'll just have a more direct one-to-one chat if you feel that's more appropriate to discuss specific issues and vulnerabilities. So hopefully that does answer your question, but if not, just let us know. Recommendation for implementing zoning tiering when the organization has little appetite for implementing privileged access workstations, so poor. Probably the two things are independent, but go on.
Yes. So the structure that we've talked about today does not require privileged access workstations for the administrators, and that was a very, very deliberate choice, because when we assessed kind of the most pragmatic solutions for this, we discovered that you can get the overwhelming majority of the benefit without actually physically separating out the workstations. But when you physically separate out the workstations, you get that final 1% of the benefit. That adds a lot of administrative restriction and a lot of administrative frustration into the mix, and and also cost. If you've got a large administrative environment, you're then talking about maintaining maybe 100 or a couple of hundred, maybe even 300 additional machines, depending on the number of administrators that you've got. So the way that the system works is that, so for example, any given administrator in the structure that we've been talking about gets a single administrator would have both a client admin account and a server admin account and a domain admin account. The domain admin account would only be able to log on to domain controllers. Now, you would be RDPing, so a password would pass through the machine, that the client machine that the administrator is working on, but it doesn't get cached. And this reduces the attack window from whenever an attacker chooses to show up and lift the cached credentials, which can be months if passwords don't change. It reduces that attack window down to the microsecond that that username and password actually passes through system memory on the client on its way to validate against the remote desktop server. And it raises the requirement that you have to be monitoring system memory in order to get it. You can't just be a user and dig into something that's cached on the machine. You actually have to have a monitoring attack agent in memory, monitoring system memory at the moment that an administrator connects through. It's not impossible, but it's massively harder. And once again, someone trying to install such an agent in system memory on a client will flag the monitoring process, because that's not a normal piece of behavior. So once again, by removing the cache, we're forcing an attacker to do something that is going to be much more visible to the defensive software, slowing them down, taking away their standardized pathway. So that's why we can gain the overwhelming majority of the benefit of zoning while still not actually having to physically zone the accounts on different systems. We're logically zoning them by separating the administrative powers out onto different logins, and then choosing where those logins can be used. I hope that answers that one. Again, if you want some more information on that, just, contact the team and with any further information you want or any further questions you want. Jim, what's next?
So I think that is a wrap. Thank you. There's some kind words in there from Sean. Appreciate that. And Dan, hopefully that does answer. So there's one final thing. So essentially, we'd avoid running admin tools locally. Yeah, I think that's the answer to that. Yes. In that case, I think we're just about done. If there's any other questions or if you've missed anything, we'll have another double check after the event. We will reach out with questions and the responses. If anyone's interested in the complimentary AD assessment, we're offering that to everybody that's joined. So we'll reach out and ask the question on that. And like I said, there is one sort of I think we're doing some sort of tombola, are we? Prize draw offering for a more in-depth consultancy that we'll do. That I think we may have done that for a lot of people that are on the call anyway as part of the NHS work that we've done. But anyone that's not NHS based will help you understand your position and do the audit that we've talked about briefly throughout the event. Anything apart from that, by all means, get in touch. And if there's nothing else, then thank you very much indeed for your attendance. It is appreciated. We know you're all very busy. And we'll hopefully see you again soon. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for coming, everyone. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.